What are some government secrets that have been declassified that most people still don't know about? We ducked up the Castle Bravo test. For those who don't know, the Castle Bravo test was the largest nuclear explosion ever produced by the United States. The short and sweet is that we packed the explosive components in with a bunch of benign substance. The benign substance was an isotope of the explosive Ht. So the ratio was like %60 of the active element and %40 inactive. We didn't know that if you blast the inactive isotope with enough energy it transforms itself into the active isotope. We made the explosion much bigger than intended and it almost killed the skeleton crew in the observation bunker. We estimated beforehand that the explosion would be somewhere in between 4 mgt and 8 mgt. 8 being the scary big end of the spectrum. It was 15 ducking megatons. Operation Northwoods. The U.S. was going to bomb its own cities. Blame it on Cuba and declare war. Edit. Certain personnel wanted to create a false flag operation. From what I was told, it wasn't to bomb the cities so. However, Kennedy pretty much said duck no. You're not doing that. Furthermore, he removed Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after. Edit. Jesus duck people, I get it, he got shot. Making a 10th comment about it is unnecessary at this point. Thank God Kennedy was a charismatic and relatively open president over a practical and rigid one. He could have done some serious damage had he done what other people had wanted him to at many points, bombing and invading Cuba. That whole ducking plan of the fake terrorist attack. Various threats from USSR and other nations. Etc. Close bracket. That the US granted various high-ranking Nazis a place in our society in return for various services. Some guilty of war crimes were among them. Yep. Werner von Braun was a high-ranking SS officer. He designed the V-2 rocket that detonated London and used slave labor from local concentration camps to build them. But we all know him as the chief designer of the Saturn V rocket, which took NASA's Apollo program astronauts to the moon 6 times. When American Indian Movement, AIM, protesters occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, headquarters in 1972. They found secret documents that some native women had been sterilized without their knowledge or consent. All people need to know this. Genocide by America really isn't acknowledged like it should be. Edit. Spelling. I can't suggest the book War Against the Weak enough for this. It's well referenced, well written, and is extremely comprehensive about the American eugenics movement for its small size. It's incredible how fervently genocide was practiced in the US. During World War II, Stalin warned the Japanese that the US was planning on bombing Formosa, practically giving away our plans to invade the Philippines. He didn't want the war to end too soon as it would cut down on the territories he could conquer and claim for the USSR. Damn commies. The USSR was just about to join in on the war in Japan, having already defeated Japan in a war a few years earlier. But to prevent the USSR from getting a piece of the Japanese pie like they did all over Europe, America instead decided to drop the atomic bomb on Japan twice. Take this all into account, with America and the UK banking on Germany beating or at least severely crippling the USSR and only invading once the USSR was already pushing to Berlin. You can easily reverse it and say the US and UK were the scumbags. The US government allowed criminals to buy weapons from gun stores and transport them to Mexico. Also parts to make grenades. These guns have killed, at least, over 200 people, including a US Border Patrol agent. Eric Holder was forced to release over 60,000 pages of documents last night. Not getting a lot of attention though because of the elections. Edit. Operation Fast and Furious. They also then prosecuted the gun shop owners and stripped them of their licenses for selling the weapons. The cat bomb. The US Office of Strategic Services decided that the best way to ensure that their bombs reached the intended naval targets was to strap them to cats and drop the cats from planes with parachutes. It was believed that the cats would naturally avoid the water and direct their payload to enemy decks. The project was declared a failure because no way was found to stop the cats from fainting in midair. Edit. Before anyone else decides to inform me. Yes. I know about the bat bomb. It's just not as unbelievable as the cat bomb. Which is even sort of funny to say. Thanks to Batman. Bat bomb doesn't sound nearly as far-fetched. Edit 2. Since people still aren't getting the message. Stop telling Emmy about the damn bat bomb. Project MK Ultra. During the Cold War, the CIA initiated Project MK Ultra, a secret and illegal human research program to investigate potential mind control systems. The program's operators examined the effects of hypnosis, biological agents and drugs, such as LSD and barbiturates, on human subjects. Some historians suggest the program was designed to develop a mind control system that could be used to program the brains of potential assassins. The numbers. Mason. Also, on a serious note, some believe that Lee Harvey Oswald is an example of MK Ultra. Also, Jason Bourne was experimented on in a similar way, if I remember the films right. There are a number of secrets from World War II and after that have been declassified yet few know about. Most involve things like troop movements, etc. It may seem weird to only declassify them decades later, but the fact is military doctrine changes very slowly, and even something as simple as a janitorial supply list can give a good estimate of the number of personnel in an area. Area 51. Tested MiGs. Stealth tech. Used it to evaluate US recon satellites and screw around with the Ruskies. Who the duck has not heard of Area 51? It was only recently that the government officially disclosed the existence to Area 51. Before then it was still classified and denied existence if anyone asked. From Some Flying magazine. The SR-71 was introduced in 1966. At a time in which commercial aircraft were pretty much limited to 25-30k feet altitude. Maximum. There was a very junior air traffic controller. Bored out of his mind. Minding a ATC center somewhere in the heartland. Now. He frequently handled and scheduled changes in altitude. Pilots would call them in and he'd routinely grant the change. This evening. He gets a call. Northfield ATC. This is Rainbird 27. Requesting altitude 50,000. Controller. Okay. Rainbird 27. If you can get up to 50k, you can have it. Rainbird 27. Roger that. Descending to 50k. Thanks and good night. If you cross Detroit's southern border, you are in Canada. What crashed in Roswell was declassified in the early 90s. It was a cluster of balloons being developed to listen for nuclear detonations. There's a layer in the atmosphere where a loud enough sound can actually carry around the world. The project became pointless before it was completed by the invention of satellites. Late to the thread. But Julia Child was an OSS operative. The OSS was the precursor to the CIA. This was declassified not very long ago. She did work in the China-Burma-India theater, I believe. The United States supported the brutal dictator Pinochet, assassinated Colonel Schneider, and trained DINA, Chilean intelligence paramilitary group that committed human rights abuses including disappearances, deaths, and torture. Nixon and Kissinger damaged Chile's economy in order to destabilize the country, creating a coup climate. These files have been declassified and you can read them all in the Pinochet file. Asterisk. Operation Fast and Furious. The ATF purposely selling guns to cartels to try and trace them to high-ranking cartel members. Yet I believe no arrests came of it. And at least one of the guns was used in the murder of a border patrol agent. I'm really surprised that this one isn't in the list. Nixon committed treason. In the run-up to the '68 election, he engineered it so that the Vietnamese government wouldn't accept the ceasefire that Johnson had negotiated. Even George will concede that the proof is incontrovertible. UK here. During World War II there was a night ferry off the Dorset coast. This was in fact a government experiment ship spraying virus and bacteria over Dorset so they could measure how far the cloud went by counting the dead. Before D-Day, the US military had a rehearsal mission named Operation Tiger. There was a coordination problem that caused friendly fire. Over 900 Americans died. The government didn't inform the families until after D-Day and reported that that's where they died. My gran worked at Bletchley Park during World War II, deciphering messages, including one that supposedly cut the war short by about 6 months. I know a lot of it is already known, but not much of actually declassified yet. And not half as interesting ducked up as some of these. But they wouldn't even acknowledge she worked there until 6 years ago. Even then, it was just someone from the mod knocking on her door unannounced and handing her a medal. She died a few years ago and never really spoke of what she did there. TL. Dr. Gran worked with Enigma machines. We think Area 51 was as an experimental airbase. The reason they guard it so closely isn't because of aliens, but rather that it's the place we test very sensitive aircraft and similar things that have the potential to change warfare to a fundamental level. The SR-71 was developed there and tested many times. We also tried to develop a flying saucer. There's a video that shows someone driving a floating circular disc that Hitler had also tried to develop. They didn't go through with it because the scientists decided that the time would be wasted to try and make an actual high altitude one. They declassified this a good bit ago. But people are too focused on the alien aspect that they don't care. Personally, I think the government would go to these extremes for technology that allows us to spy on our enemies' allies almost undetected much faster than they would for a little green dude. More or less the whole Ricky Ross scandal. CIA needed funding for the Contra War in the 80s, so it got into the cocaine crack trade to facilitate it. Caused the crack boom of the 80s. Sent hundreds of thousands to jail. All to help fund a rebel group that was overthrowing a democratically elected leader. Classic foreign policy plus major hypocrisy. The CIA funded and worked with the Sicilian Mafia after World War II to establish a foothold in Italy. Reagan sabotaged Carter's hostage negotiations with the Iranians. The CIA had black sites all over the globe where they kidnapped and tortured people. Still do. The US funded warlords in Somalia up to at least 2006 that we know of. The US used to fund the Dalai Lama. That the US government, from World War II to the mid-1970s, funded an ESP project that involved using remote viewing to gather intelligence data. While information gathered by teams of remote viewers were found to be accurate, the US government denies that any of it was ever deemed useful for intelligence purposes. Yeah, there was a project to look into it. But just because the government funds something doesn't mean it actually works. Anything that came up as accurate was later concluded to be either an educated guess or an altered report. Keep in mind that this was an expensive program that people wanted to justify. This is kind of related. But back in the 50s, the US CIA had a spy plane, U-2, that would fly on the edge of our atmosphere, around 70,000 feet. The pilot actually had to wear a spacesuit. It was thrust into the public when the Russians shot one down in 1960. It just blows my mind that there are still countries in the world that have not come close to reaching space. But the CIA had a plane 60 years ago that could fly at that height, and it was completely secret. In 2013, they released a declassified packet of information explaining that Area 51 was largely used as a U-2 testing and pilot training ground. It makes me wonder what kind of crap they have now that is still kept secret. The UFO crash in Roswell? That was actually a piece of top secret military hardware that had to be picked up because it crashed, thus the military presence and men in suits visiting houses of people who found it, because you know, the Cold War, Russian spies, all of that. They didn't declassify it until recently. Operation Downfall. It was the planned invasion of Japan by the USA in 1945 to end the war if the A-bombs were not used. It was declassified in the 1990s. I'm not saying using the A-bombs was correct or wrong. But looking at the projected deaths on both sides and the build-up before by both sides, World War I deaths would probably seem like a cakewalk in comparison to the deaths expected. Oleg Penkovsky. He was a double agent working for the West between 1961-62. He clearly states in his first meeting, paragraph 106, with officers from MI6 and the CIA that Khrushchev wasn't ready for war. In meeting 4 he outlines a plan to decapitate the Soviet government, with a special focus on the military, through the use of 1 or 2 kiloton bombs. Based on margin notes of this meeting, some of what he said was considered. The CIA, led by George Bush, trained Osama bin Laden. George Bush and Queen Elizabeth are related. JFK received a huge amount of campaign funds from John Factor, cosmetic king Max Factor's brother. John Factor had several mafia ties as a convicted criminal in England and the US, and when England applied for his extradition, JFK gave him a full presidential pardon, thus saving him from a lengthy jail term. The bat bomb. The idea was that a few hundred bats would be dropped in a parachuting trays. The bats would then nest in a Japanese city and the incendiary devices attached to them would go off, burning the city to the ground. They even constructed a mock Japanese village in the desert to test it. Eventually though, the Air Force's attitude became, "We don't need those damn bats. We have something better, the Manhattan Project."